Awesome. You're muted, but I got the recording sound, so we're good to go. Thank you. All right, folks, let's get this Istio working group meeting kicked off. I'm going to share my screen here and start looking through the various topics that folks have proposed for today. Hopefully that's readable for folks. First up, Mike Krinken, talk to us about trust domain aliases in zTunnel.
Yeah, one of the ambient multi-cluster sort of early users tried to set up trust domain aliases and it didn't work. The use case that they had for them is like a little bit weird, or it seems like it, but regardless of that, I think we kind of want to add support for trust domain aliases into ambient. So I put down some document proposal that suggested some changes and on like what needs to be done there. Basically, there are two parts essentially. One is zTunnel currently is like unaware completely of trust domain aliases. It knows about the actual trust domain, but not the aliases part. So we probably should just put the trust domain aliases into WDS so that zTunnel can verify incoming connections. And the other bit is when we actually connect into the service, we put identities into the SANs. So that part could be done like completely in the pilot. We can just generate all the possible SANs. And it's similar to what Sidecar does currently. So that's the proposal. If anybody has any concerns, I'm happy to hear some feedback. In particular, if you start like populating that information, right, when you start configuring multiple aliases for whatever reason, the list of SANs for services might grow quite a bit. So if you think that it's a concern, we can consider some alternative approaches like more normalized representation. But I think this one is the easiest way to go, and it's also similar to what Sidecar does. So I think it's okay.
Yeah, one thing I don't like about this, and I'm coming with problems, not solutions, because I've thought about
That's fine.
is that the trust domain aliases are really a global setting, but now we're blasting this out onto every pod. And so if I have 20 trust domain aliases times 100,000 pods, now we have whatever the math is there on the same strings repeated all over the place. That can easily double or more the workload size. So like for some context, in Sidecar mode where we do sort of the same, we put on each cluster, which is each service, which is less than workloads. But we actually saw people that chose not to use trust domain aliases because enabling trust domain aliases like quadrupled the RAM of Envoy or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it did have some real world issues in the past with doing this. Now the problem and why I didn't come with an immediate solution is that we don't have like a global dynamic configuration in zTunnel at all, right? We have either static global stuff or of course workload and service. So like off the top of my head, like alternative could be we add like a settings option or something, or mesh config or proxy config, whatever we want to name it or call it. That's dynamic over XJS. Or we could also force users to do this more statically at zTunnel. That would be the easiest approach for sure. But I'd have to think through this a bit more.
Yeah, static is the easiest approach, but it wouldn't be exactly like parity with how sidecars like behave. Like forget about sidecar implementation; they dynamically change those if the mesh config changes, right? But yeah, I see. I get the feedback. I will think about. It was like proposed in the alternatives that maybe we can have something like an alternative dynamic distribution mechanism specifically for like global configurations like that. One caveat there, and I wanted to hear what you think about it. For SAN specifically, right? Pilot generates all the identities and distributes them to the tunnels, right? If you start distributing like aliases separately, right? The tunnel kind of will, we either will have to change how we distribute identities to for services, like instead of like the sun field that contains all the strings, all the possible identities as like sort of opaque strings, we would have to change the format of representation or let the tunnel somehow modify those identities, like actually parse the string, extract the trust domain from SPIFFE identity and generate all the possible combinations. That seems to be like problematic. I don't have any particular technical concerns with that in the sense that it could be possible to implement, but it looks very ugly and concerning.
On a related topic,
Mhm.
and I'm maybe a little rusty here, so somebody may be more familiar. In authorization policy, when we match against principal, do we match against every alias, or do we match against some normalized single value?
I think that by default, when you don't configure anything, it matches. The client does the check. When the client does the check, no, actually, both client and server side checks, they allow all the aliases. But I think that you can actually define an actual authorization policy and check there for a specific trust domain. And like, for example, you can define on top of that a policy that will disallow alternatives. I think that's how it works, but I will have to double check.
Right. So this is that part is really important, right? Because the question is, what are people trying to achieve? Right. There's kind of two basic policies work best when there's not a lot of aliases, right? Usually people are trying to. The reason why aliases exist is because people didn't have control of their CA infrastructure. And so what they're trying to do is take a bunch of funky host names, frankly, and give them structure in a way that they can then apply policy on top. Usually it's not because I have well-structured trust domains that are durable would I be trying to alias them, because actually the trust domain is a useful piece of information. And so aliasing where we say, hey, in an authorization policy, we will match against every possible alias of a trust domain, right, is actually probably an anti-pattern for most people, because what they really want to do is normalization, right? They want to just take a bunch of weird trust domains and convert them into something regular. And so I'm trying to remember how the mapping works, right? And it's been a little bit of time since I looked at this. Like leaving aside the whole mechanics of like how it's attached to workloads or like whether it's statically centralized config, if I can have more than one alias for a trust domain, then I've created a kind of policy problem for myself. I'm going to stop there and let other people maybe pitch in on that thought.
If I can jump in, I think I'm next. I agree with you. Kit, are you ahead of me or?
I think you're
No,
ahead.
you're first, Costin. You're
Okay.
first.
Sorry, I'll answer to you first, but I want to first comment on what John said, and I completely agree with him. The current implementation is of what Sidecars is doing is one of the things I regret was the most in the existing code. It's very inefficient. It didn't work very well, and I don't think we should try to copy it in zTunnel, especially since the goal of zTunnel was to use a more sane, normalized kind of mechanism to distribute primary information. So either by watching the config map, which is dynamic as well, if we want, and I argued with John before, and I don't think it's probably the best idea, but it works, or by sending another discovery that is just the aliases, or sending the mesh config, or any of those options that are sending the alias as a primitive type, and we treat it as a primitive type, and we are aware that it's an alias and not just something that pilot made up and try to kind of work around and mix with authorization policies would be a much better and safer approach. And that also addresses what Louis is saying is, Ztunnel is aware that this is the list of aliases. It has far more flexibility and it will work better with authorization policies, which right now I think it's what I put in the comment. It's the aliases are still overriding the policies or are additional to policies. In any case, I think fixing aliases is very useful. It will also be a bit tricky to not change behavior, but maybe changing behavior is a good idea at this point.
I see. Just to summarize, I guess what I'm hearing and to check with you. First of all, one concern is with the implementation itself. We don't want redundantly distribute all the trust aliases that, given that they're the same for the cluster for each workload. That one of the things that would require some alternative mechanism compared to existing WDS. And the other part is, we need to check what is actually happening when you define a policy. And policy refers to one of the aliases, but not all of them. And formalize what we actually want to do in this case. Do we want to reject? Do we want to accept or not? If policy refers to one of the aliases, but the request or peer presents the identity with another alias. Is that roughly matching the feedback that I heard here?
Keith, I'll let you go ahead, but I did go back and check the existing Istio docs, so I maybe have some refinement to make in my comment.
Yeah, I think that from what I read of the issue, as I understand it, I think what the user's trying to do is something more akin to trust domain federation, where you essentially have a bunch of aliases that start off as the same, and then you have authorization policies to allow or deny specific, for example, clusters or specific trust domains to talk to a particular service. So it might be the same service from a namespace perspective in Kubernetes because it's in the similar cluster, the similar namespace, because the trust domain is different. I think auth-z policy, I might be wrong, but I think auth-z policy does a raw string match and does not include aliases for principals, which would sort of let you do that sort of federated thing. There's a sample PR that I think Jacek added. And even though it's not explicitly supported, like the original use case for trust domains was migration, completely agree, Costin. But I think because trust domain federation has not been supported, users have come up with their own way of doing it. And I don't know how easy it is to put that genie back in the bottle, so to speak. Louis, I think you're next.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, like, if you look at the documentation about trust domain migration, right, it basically talks about trying to maintain policy stability. And I think you're right, Keith, that some of that is because of federation where there's a lack of control over trust domain, right? There are certainly certain CA implementations don't really give end users a lot of control over what the trust domain is. Like Google's workload identity management system, for instance, you don't actually get to control the trust domain in it. It's a kind of predefined format by Google. And so you would have to alias it into something. Either way, the goal is to maintain policy stability, right? That's the clear aim of the system. Now, whether that's, right, and we're obviously showing, like, and if you look in the mesh config, right, we have a field just trust domain, right, which is the standard configured trust domain for the cluster and the one that would expect to be provisioned if you're using the built-in CA and everything along those lines. And so the example that we provided talks about having a policy that used an old CA, sorry, an old trust domain, and then used aliases to say that the new trust domain was an alias of the old one. The old one was an alias of the new one, but the policy would remain stable. Which almost seems backwards. Right, where really what you would want was, if the new trust domain was an implementation detail, then the new trust domain would be an alias of the old one, right? And the policy would remain stable because the policy was going to use whatever the canonical trust domain was.
So just want to interject here. We've got a lot of topics on the agenda, and we're within about 20 minutes on this. It sounds like there needs to be more discussion.
Yeah, I will circle back with this next time after I check a few things.
Well, let's start a thread in Slack on it.
Yeah, will do.
All right. Thank you. Next one is Envoy Edge proxy configuration. I dropped this into the agenda just because I saw it I saw it sort of appear in the docs review category, and think there's a lot of really good stuff here, especially as we're seeing some users in GitHub try to migrate to Istio Ingress with the Ingress Engine Next deprecation. So Steve Chris, I believe, is here. I think he's probably better to go through this than I am, since it's his doc. So Steve, you want to sort of highlight the problem and talk through your proposal?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try not to take up too much time since I know we have a long agenda. But yeah, we're interested in implementing Envoy's Edge proxy config recommendations for Istio gateways. So for folks who aren't familiar, Envoy documents a number of recommended settings for when it's deployed as an edge proxy as opposed to a sidecar in a service mesh. And these settings are not necessarily enabled by default. And they're not all enabled for Istio gateways today. It is possible to set some of these through the use of Envoy filters, but it's certainly not very user-friendly. It's not kind of a first-class API in Istio, and so we'd like to see kind of a more user-friendly, more first-class way to enable these settings for Istio gateways. So yeah, Keith, if you scroll down to the design ideas, I'll skip over some of the background here. We're basically looking for a way to fit this into an API or some way for users to configure these settings. So the first proposal that we have here is to add some fields to proxy config to be able to enable these settings. So the way that we sketch this out here is that there would be kind of a blanket setting called enable edge proxy settings or something similar, which would be a Boolean. And if this is set to true, it would essentially enable all of the Envoy recommended settings that have a kind of a static value. So for example, listener and cluster buffer limits, Envoy recommends setting them to 32 KB. So essentially when this field was set to true, we would enable those settings by default. And then additionally, we would have a number of kind of granular fields added to proxy config for each of the individual settings. And so users could come in here and override any of the settings if they needed to for their particular environment. Additionally, for some of the recommendations where Envoy doesn't provide a specific value, and they simply recommend that a setting be set. So for example, some of the timeouts or listener connection limits, users could come in here and set those values appropriately for their environment. So there's certainly some pros and cons to using proxy config, and I'm interested in hearing folks' opinions on that. But I'll just, the other option that we kind of thought about was rather than doing this in proxy config, we could support some additional annotations on gateway pods, which essentially would look very similar to what we proposed for proxy config, but would just go directly on the gateway in the form of annotations and cover the same set of options. And then beyond that, some of the other settings affect Bootstrap config. So the biggest one is the overload manager, which I know lots of folks have looked at in the past. When we thought about this, we kind of felt like any API that we designed in Istio to control configuring the overload manager would end up looking a lot like the Envoy API anyway. And so we were pretty comfortable with just sticking with a config map to store Bootstrap config, which would be defined by the users. The main thing that we were thinking about here, which I think actually John Howard maybe proposed in an issue a while back, but supporting there's an annotation that's supported for sidecars that makes it easy to mount a config map into a pod and to use it as a custom bootstrap for sidecars. So essentially supporting that same annotation for gateways to improve the UX so that these can be defined more easily by the users. Yeah, so I guess I'll pause there and give folks a chance to ask any questions or make any comments.
So first off, thanks for putting this together. I think there's been a lot of hesitation in the past around exposing some of these granular protocol configurations in Istio APIs. But as I've been talking to people who are running edge proxies, whether it's Ingress Engine X or other things in the ecosystem, they are looking for that degree of control to be able to control buffer sizes and tune the behavior of their proxy based on their payloads. So I'm starting to feel like this sort of thing is necessary API wise, because you need to express it, and it just shouldn't require an Envoy filter to be able to express some of these things. I think there's definitely a discussion to be had around which API we use to expose it. Proxy config seems reasonable. But I guess initially, I'd like to maybe get agreement that I'm on the side of this needs doing. Do we need to expose these things? Does anyone disagree with that? We should probably discuss.
No, I think it's fair that people need the ability to set these settings. I'm just trying to rationalize the different API choices in my head.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Louis. Yeah, I'm not sure on this exact API, but it makes sense to, especially now, given recent changes, I think it makes sense to make this more configurable or easier to configure for users.
Do we know how much appetite there is for setting things beyond a set of reasonable defaults that we pick as a first iteration? Like if we just said, if there's a flag, enable edge profile or whatever we want to call it, do we know today that there are people who need to change those default values?
I've seen enough. Well, I mean, let Ricardo go because he's got a lot of experience here as well. But yeah, I've seen enough users who are wanting to jam a bunch of things in a bunch of headers in, for example, to override like the max number of headers, or they're dealing with uploads and need to change initial buffer sizes there. I guess my bias working for a hyperscaler is how we just see so many people in those edge cases to where they're going to want to have limits and things that are above or below the defaults. So my tendency would be to allow those, but process-wise, I don't have an issue with starting with that flag and then on a case-by-case basis adding different fields. Ricardo?
No, I was just gonna echo what you said, but you said correctly. Like there are a lot of cases of people just willing to change buffers or global timeouts and other things that you know, either to add security or to soften some restrictions that make sense to them or to applications. So yeah, I've seen a lot of that as well in the wild.
Is
Yeah, I
there
think- Go ahead.
just to extend the testing of that a little bit, do you think it's possible to t-shirt size those into different named profiles? Right, by those types of scenarios, like, hey, and maybe it's hard, right, because the timeouts are orthogonal to buffer sizes, right? I get that.
Yeah, it's a bit the combinatorial thing is a t-shirt size for each field, and yeah.
Would that actually also make difference, Keith? On like, I think I've seen a story somewhere on log format as well, and I don't know if this is the case. Like people want to, you know, change Envoy log format to their own exporter, or they are not even, you know, getting those logs. So I'm not sure if this is also the right place to, you know, to make this kind of configuration.
So we have to be very careful. So we do. Istio does have ways to like well-documented ways of changing the Envoy log format of getting access logs, because by default we don't have access logs. That might be a default worth changing at some point, because I've seen that confusion too. But I want to be. I don't want us to fall into the ingress API trap where, because we're able to add annotations, we start defaulting or trying to put everything we can in annotations in the name of simplicity. We should absolutely prefer clear APIs where we can to, you know, try to better provide a better user experience. For things that are proxy specific and they're basically pass through, like these settings, for example, these are artifacts of Envoy. If we're an Nginx data plane or, you know, relevant to our conversation, if it's an agent gateway data plane, they're going to look very different. So that is sort of my personal bar for what belongs in sort of a quick unstructured annotation versus a proper API.
Right. The other question I have is the application of a pattern. Right. Let's say we use proxy config. How do we want people to go about leveraging it? Right. Per instance, per gateway class. I don't believe we allow you to attach proxy config to gateway class right now. We don't let people create other gateway classes either. So.
Well, so what you can do is you can, when you configure through the gateway class overrides at a gateway class level, you can set annotations for all the gateway classes or for all instances of that gateway class. So what you would do is you would have annotation in the gateway class customization that would then be able to take effect to all of the gateways in that get created from that gateway class.
Right. So we're going to annotate with the proxy config reference.
Proxy config is an annotation. In this case, the proxy config CRD is basically useless. So you would have the gateway class configuration, the gateway class customization, excuse me, would have a override on the deployment template, and you would set the proxy config annotations on that deployment reference.
Mm-hmm. But since we don't have a way to permute gateway classes, there's not a ton of value in that pattern as opposed to just having people put it on gateway. There's a little in that it's kind of standardization, but it doesn't allow for customization.
Sorry, my internet glitched. Can you say that one more time?
We don't let people create other gateway classes, right? So the amount of variability you can achieve is very low using gateway class, you can basically say Istio ingress is always going to have this proxy config. So if you create lots of Istio ingress gateways, then they'll all get the same one. And then I would have to manually.
Go ahead.
Right, but I can't create classes where they have different proxy configs.
No, so you would, there's not a granularity in between all gateway classes versus specific gateway.
Right. Which will probably lead people just putting it directly in the gateways, frankly.
Sure. I think that's actually one of the benefits of proxy config is that because it's an annotation, users have that choice.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah. I guess go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were done.
Yeah, I was just going to say then I think I prefer the proxy config variant, definitely over the annotation variant.
I'm confused since proxy config is annotations.
No. The other one where we configure the individual properties as annotations.
Ah, I see. So having it be a thing in proxy config versus a top level annotation. Yep.
Yeah.
I agree with that. So I guess action item for folks is to continue to read and comment and look through the doc. I guess the next step, Steve, practically maybe seeing a draft PR for the proxy config. I think we store all those in Istio API still, so maybe a draft to sort of show what that would look like would be might help with decision making.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good.
Excellent. So I unfortunately have to run to a conflict here in a moment. Can someone else volunteer to screen share the agenda and continue running the meeting?
Yeah, I can do that.
All right. Okay. I'm heading out. Thanks, Louis, for running it. Talk to everybody later.
Sure. Okay. Gustavo, avoid lasering backends behind East-West Gateway.
Yeah. Hello, folks. So yeah, we have this issue opened on GitHub, and I've been working on it. And I guess I want to understand, from the community, from the maintainers, if this could be considered a blocker for 129, and given that, I guess. Francisco is already looking for dates around, I think, the end of the release date, the 12th of February at the moment. Yeah, if there's, if we know of ways to mitigate this, if we can agree on some ways to mitigate this. But the problem is basically, and please, Mikhail, please interrupt me because usually you explain this problem much better than me, but in multi-cluster, multi-network, right, in ambient, we have this issue where if we have a request that went through Z-tunnel and that Z-tunnel goes to a waypoint, right, and we need to route that to a remote cluster. From the point of view of the waypoint, the remote cluster is just like a single Envoy endpoint, right? So there's not really much you can do in terms of load balancing there, right? And once we establish that connection, that the double H bone between the waypoint and the East-West Gateway, we have a good chance of lasering the same backend in the remote cluster, right? So yeah, I mean, for some people, it can be like a kind of a bad.
Gustavo, can you just, for my sake, can you elaborate on what you mean by lasering?
Okay, yeah, because what happens is when we create that the double H bone tunnel, right? Every request coming and arriving at the East-West Gateway, they'll be redirected to the same backend. and there's no way for the east-west gateway to understand, different requests coming through the tunnel, right? Because like it's just like H-bone traffic. We have no idea of different requests that are coming through. And once the H-bone, the double H-bone connection is already established, that's the only way the east-west gateway can make a choice of each backend that's going for. So yeah, we end up like whenever we're using that the double H-bone connection, the double H-bone tunnel, we're basically lasering the same endpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps me. I wonder, so this is coming from Envoy. This doesn't happen when the request originates from a Z tunnel to the other cluster, right?
Yeah, this is particularly particular for when you have like multi-network, right? When you have like an east-west gateway. I think that Mikhail, you have the raised hand there, Mikhail. You probably can explain this a bit better than me if you want.
Yeah, so let's step back for a second. I will try to collect all the different pieces that contribute to it, right? One of the pieces is Waypoint Envoy does multiplexing of multiple requests over the same connection. The other relevant part is when we represent all the backends on a remote network to Envoy as a single split horizon endpoint, right? As opposed to having multiple for each individual backend. So Envoy will pick an endpoint that represents remote network, establish a connection, and will multiplex multiple requests together. The second bit that is relevant here is east-west gateway and double H-bone, right? East-west gateway doesn't look at the actual requests. It unwraps the external H-bone connection and transfers internal H-bone connection as an APAC stream of bytes, essentially, right? So it cannot see individual requests and it cannot route those individually, right? So it basically will have to establish a single connection to a backend and route everything to that backend. So that's why we can laser the same backend in remote network. In Z-tunnel, we actually know when we establish a double H-bone or single H-bone connection. And when we do double H-bone, we just don't have much connection pooling involved, right? And that's basically part of the implementation logic in the tunnel. In Envoy, it's slightly different. In Envoy, we have a single cluster with a single configuration for that cluster on how to do HTTP2 multiplexing. And if we do the same thing as we do in the tunnel, it means for all the endpoints of the service, we will disable connection pooling, which is not what we want. We don't want to affect local endpoints and establish a new connection every time for local endpoints. So that's what creates an issue, and that's where the difference between Waypoint and Z-tunnel comes from. And one of the things to mention, I think, is that I think sort of long-term or mid-term solution for this issue is that we want to contribute an option to upstream Envoy. And the upstream Envoy community, in principle, receptive to that, to allow to override the connection pooling or HTTP2 options in the cluster at the level of individual endpoints, right? So once that is an upstream, right, we can just use that in Istio, right? But it's not an upstream yet, right? And the question becomes, is it possible for us to find some alternative solution until we land it upstream in Envoy? And that's where the Gustavo is coming from, right? Where the deadlines are coming into play. And the question is it strictly a blocker, or what do you think? Is it strictly a blocker for declaring the feature better quality or not, right? I hope that provides enough context.
Yeah, I was just in terms of wondering about alternatives. If we're originating a request from Envoy, we already have certainty that this is an L7 process, not an L4 process. So can we force Envoy to reconnect after n requests, where n could be 1 or 10, or I don't know what the right number would be.
The problem
the short
here.
answer there is no, Mitch.
Okay.
I mean, you can, but the problem is it comes with a pretty heavy downside. It will apply to all connections, not just those that goes to a remote network. Right. That's the biggest issue. That's why we don't want to do that. Like, we'd rather take lasering than that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
The other problem here, by the way, is Waypoint itself is fan-in, right, from the client workloads within the cluster. So you have, right, if you had no Waypoint, at least the client workloads would have individual connections to east-wests, and the east-west would therefore have individual connections downstream. So you'd get reasonable L4 load balancing that way. When you introduce Waypoint, you lose most of that client diversity. In fact, you lose all of that client diversity. One of the few solutions to this is to scale up the number of waypoints, right? That at least will scale up the number of connections to east-west and will do a slightly better job, but either way, it's still terrible. And I would never suggest that as the actual workaround that any user uses. It's a terrible suggestion. Right, and this is the problem of going through an L7 before you go through an L4, right, fundamentally, a fan-in gateway. Yeah. So, Mike, you suggested that there was a proposal to go do things with Envoy.
Yeah.
What was discussed, right? Because, right, in reality, it's not a load balancing problem. It is an endpoint problem. Right, there's more than one endpoint behind the east-west gateway, right?
So, yeah, I can elaborate a little bit, right? So currently we can set various limits in Envoy at the cluster level, essentially, on how you multiplex multiple requests. Like, for example, one of the options that I kind of like as a midterm solution is that you can limit the number of concurrent requests, right? So if Envoy already handling a stream on HTTP connection at the moment, right, in the sense that the stream is active, right, and another request comes, you can configure Envoy to say like, oh, well, let's keep the old connection working, and we will use it, and the ongoing request will go, but we'll open a new connection for a new stream, right? The old connection, like once the stream is processed, it could be reused for something else. So you get some connection pooling, but if you get a lot of requests, they're not like multiplexed concurrently together, which is kind of a good balance, I think. We can do that.
So that's like using max concurrent streams to force Envoy to create more connections.
Yes, to create the number of, like, we can limit still as a total number of connections, right? And then the request will wait. But yes, pretty much we will create as many connections as we have, like sort of concurrent requests, if we don't put other limits in place. So that's sort of one of the options that we could potentially consider, yeah.
Right, but that's kind of pathological behavior because each of those connections, well, there's a TLS handshake, right? So if we're scaling by number of requests, right?
Concurrent requests.
We'll get reasonable distribution of load, but at a poor amortization cost for TLS.
That's where the concurrent part, I think, is relevant, right? We don't have to start a new connection for each request. We can reuse the existing connections.
Right, we say each connection is like max concurrent streams 1. So every time there's a concurrent, we create a new connection. Let's say we have 100 requests, right? We will create 100 connections, right? Which, 100 like concurrent RPS is not that high. That's really expensive. So let's say there are 3 backends, right? Nominally in the remote cluster, right? For diversity, we would really only need 3 connections. Now we may want to like over provision, right? Just because we all know load balancing at L4 doesn't always work the way we expect it to. So let's say you said, I'm going to create a connection for up to 2 times the number of known endpoints behind this.
Yes, you can put that limit, yeah. On top of the concurrent connections as well.
So you have to say max connections.
Yes.
But then you need it to be dynamic, right? Let's say the number of endpoints goes from 3 to 10.
Yes, and that we can do. Wow. If not currently, like part of the proposal is that you can override the cluster level settings, HTTP settings, at the endpoint level, and we generate those endpoints with the metadata, as part of like the whole EDS process. That's the idea.
Okay, so that proposal, yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally that's kind of what has to happen. I think that's going to take a while to get done in Envoy, right? So let's put a pin in for what there's some solution in Envoy that will correct for this. We can probably go into the weeds on it. It will take time, undoubtedly, because what we just discussed is complicated. What can happen in the interim?
So in interim, we don't really have good workarounds. We can like have some hacks in the sense that we can manipulate a little bit like pre-connect ratio or things like that. But ultimately, the proposal that I think makes sense is, given that it takes a long time to implement in upstream Envoy, would it be possible to do that, like add an extension to a Istio proxy version, like as a Envoy extension, until we upstream it, right? That would be the alternative proposal, I think, for this, for now. And I think that there is even better ultimate solution, like even better than implementing it in Envoy, but it's complicated for other reasons.
I don't claim to have well-formed opinions about the cost of doing something in a fork of Envoy, which is why Istio proxy is. Like, we've obviously done it. Do other people have thoughts about that? Because that, especially if that doesn't end up upstream, right?
Yeah, I totally understand that there is like a risk here that like Envoy folks, like in principle, agree with the proposal, but like when it comes to details, they might say, no, we don't like it, right? And we might end up in a situation where we have an Istio, another extension that we have to maintain that is not upstream, which is not great. So that's definitely a risk. But I think that the first question to answer before we even go into like possible alternative implementation is, what do people think in terms of like blocking multi-cluster better on this issue, right? That I think what will dictate how we want to approach this this solution, this problem going forward. Whether we want to like consider a fork in Istio, or do we want to like right away start with upstream Envoy and not bother with forking in Istio and try to push that through. So that's where I think the important consideration as to like which path to choose.
Let's consider the 3 fundamental topologies that are affected by this, right?
Mm-hmm.
In multi-cluster scenarios, right? I can have a service that exists in just one cluster. Exists in let's say we only have 2 clusters, then it exists in both clusters. And dividing those up again, the consumer is in the same cluster as the service, or the consumer is in a different cluster than the service. So where does the waypoint live? It might boil down to. So in a world where the service that's being called only exists in one cluster and the waypoint for it only exists in that cluster, we don't have this problem.
Yes, exactly.
When the service exists in both clusters and the waypoint only exists in one of the clusters, we have an exacerbated version of this problem. So let's say the service exists in both clusters. The waypoint exists in the same cluster as the client. In the typical case, the waypoint will load balance to the local endpoints by locality load balancing by default, and you'll get good spread because there's no problem. We're not going through an east-west. And only in a failover scenario would it go through east-west. Yes, right. So where the real problem is the waypoint is in the same cluster as the client, but there are no healthy endpoints for the service in that same cluster. Yep, in the typical scenario, which is can and will occur, but is probably not people's ideal state either. Having the waypoint in the same cluster as the client, but not in the same cluster as the endpoints, is probably an anti-pattern for most people.
Yes, right. Wait, so sorry. We by default, like if everything is like configured according to like best practice and whatnot, we'll have waypoint always in the cluster of the client, right? Because assuming the namespace sameness concerns, right, we will have waypoints in all clusters, but we will be using the ones that is local to the client, right?
We deploy waypoints local to the producer, but we call the waypoint local to the client. Right, so a typical best practice, right? Certainly when the service is not in the same cluster as the client, the waypoint is not in the same cluster as the client either. It is in the same cluster as the service. Because it's not deployed in the client's cluster.
Well, but that will break other things, right? In the sense that if the waypoint is not even available in the local cluster, the tunnel will not find it in the first place without like creating a service entry or whatnot.
John, maybe you have more state on the current functioning implementation here.
I think John dropped.
He might have dropped for. Yeah, I think we're running out of time anyway. Well, these are the types of considerations that are going to affect whether that beta decision is blocked or not.
And can you elaborate, like, which of those are like the biggest concern? Like, if we exacerbate situation in this case, then that is a blocker. What is the
if there is no reasonable deployment pattern for services and waypoints that would achieve a reasonable load balancing effect for the 80% use case, then we would be blocked. If there is a reasonable deployment pattern that avoids this problem for the most common use cases, then I suspect we're not blocked.
Let me ask you this question. When you say 80%, if I say deploy a multi-cluster setup, multi-network, and I don't set any like locality-based load balancing policy, it will distribute across everything, right? All the clusters.
We would, yes, but we almost never tell anyone to do that, right? Because
so you don't consider that setup as a reasonable deployment. That's what
I don't consider it a reliable one. You can do it, right? You can do lots of things with Istio. Would I tell anyone to go to production like that? Like, we almost never tell anybody to do flat distribution of load across all endpoints. Like, what are the use cases for doing that? No, a system where you're trying to meet a latency SLA or an availability SLA or something like that, right? Only in batch processing jobs where you're trying to flatten load out across an entire fleet might you actually care about doing that.
I think one challenge there, Louis, is that the round robin or flat distribution is the default in Kubernetes, right? So if you've not explicitly set prefer close on your service, then you get the round robin behavior.
I believe the default in zTunnel is actually locality.
For waypoints, yes. So for services, no.
Feature of the Kubernetes API.
No. When nothing is set, I believe we implicitly do prefer close.
So again, that's dependent on the Kubernetes API. The service has a setting that can be set called prefer close, but is non-default. So if the user has not explicitly said they want to prefer close for their service, then they get flat distribution.
Are you sure? I thought we defaulted to prefer close in
It's the wrong behavior, but it's effectively a result of the evolution of the Kubernetes service API because that field did not exist to begin with.
No. Like Istio's runtime can make this choice independent of how the API evolved.
Yeah, but I think Mitch is saying we respect the API.
Yeah, like how would we allow a user to set don't prefer close if not
They would
on
have
the services object?
They would use destination rule.
So then we would just ignore the setting.
No,
on
but
the
then
service?
ztunnel doesn't read destination rule.
Yeah. So Louis, right now, the way that users control that fan out behavior is with the setting on the service object that was added to Kubernetes in like 128 and has been the only thing we use in Istio ambient from the beginning.
ztunnel specifically.
Yes. Well, actually, Waypoint too, right? Waypoint, well, it's not the only thing used in Waypoint, but Waypoint also respects the prefer close.
I can tell for a fact that Waypoint configuration that is generated by default does not do any prefer close, right? You have to explicitly create a destination rule to override those settings, or like set the service level prefer close, but by default it does not happen.
Yeah, so the way the waypoints work is, I remember because I coded is I think if there is locality load balancing, it'll use that. Otherwise, it'll look at prefer close. Otherwise, it won't set anything. I'm fairly sure.
The only place where we explicitly do prefer close, even when it's not set on the service level, it's a waypoint itself, right? The waypoint service has prefer close. So that's why ztunnel always will prefer a local waypoint.
Okay. Regardless of, well, so obviously this behavior is key to, and the default behavior is key to whether this can progress to beta or not. Or is at least one factor in that decision, right? Like, I think we would all agree about that. The semantics of prefer close in the Kubernetes API are single cluster only anyway, right? Unless they've been inherited by MCS and brought into the spec somehow. Which, God, I'd have to go read up on that. Either way, right? This is a criteria to make a decision about progress to beta or not.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay,
Mike,
I guess.
we can try to
I mean,
pursue-
there are other workarounds, right? Which is that they all involve forms of creating synthetic connections, right? Or synthetic inputs. Like
yes.
an east-west gateway has multiple ports instead of one port, right? So you can overconnect to it.
Well, we can create multiple EDS endpoints, but it just kind of defeats the purpose of split horizon workloads in the first place.
I believe EDS will collapse identical endpoints.
We can make them artificially different a little bit. Like we can create, we can give them different IDs, but
does that actually work? I didn't think that actually worked.
I would have to try. I didn't try because that wouldn't be my preferred choice of like working around that. But we can test it.
I mean, I would test it. It would be useful to know. Because that way you can simulate, right, some approximation of the actual number of endpoints behind the east-west gateway.
Yes, you can. Yep.
And that makes that decision a control plane feature, not an Envoy feature.
Yes. It's just like, again, we can do it as a like temporary workaround, right? I agree with that. It's just the whole point of the split horizon workload and like segregating things in multiple networks is that you don't have to produce as many like endpoints like EDS and whatnot. But I think I'm fine with that as a like temporary workaround.
Well, like that would, like just thinking about pure load balancing characteristics, right? That would achieve the same effect as the large proposed change you want to make in Envoy.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
It would be much cheaper.
Not at runtime. Like it will be cheaper in terms of implementation, but like as far as like resources during like compute
Yes,
resources when you run this. Yeah, it's
yes, no, it won't, like, either way, like, we're going to create more connections, right? Because, like, East-West Gateway is an L4 load balancer, and the only way to get spread distribution is to send it more connections. So, like, they're going to be equivalent there. In terms of number of endpoints and the endpoints distributed over EBS, yes, it will go up. But the return is, right, we get to control the frequency at which we make updates to it, and we don't need a large new feature in Envoy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it really is worthwhile testing it.
Yeah,
that
I agree. Yeah. Cool. I think we can wrap the discussion for now. I think we're already over time, but I will bring it up next week again and after testing. It shouldn't take that long to test.
Yeah. Yeah, and please share the results of your testing in Slack, because obviously there's going to be a bit of back and forth about how, what's the best way to do that. I thought there was an effort before to look into synthetic endpoints, and I'm not sure what happened with it. So,
sure, I will do some testing this week, and we'll share how it goes.
Okay. Okay, so let me just put some notes in about. Yeah, I think we can probably wrap up here. But we should probably add some. I'll go back and add some notes to the doc. Sorry, it's hard to keep
I will do that. Don't worry about that. Okay. I'm typing right now.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you again. Well, actually, hold on. Next week, I suspect we're not going to have this meeting. Are we going to have this meeting next week? We will have this meeting next week, but not the week after. And I guess maybe a quick straw poll. Hands up. Who's not going to be here next week? Okay, doesn't look like anybody put their hand up.
I think the more interesting question to ask is who is going to be here this week.
I think ambiguity is the answer. So we'll have the meeting next week. Everybody be prepared to be disappointed. And if nobody shows up, then you were warned.
That sounds about right. And yeah, I would expect the 2 weeks after that are going to.
Yes, we are definitely not having the meeting the week after that.
Cool.
So if I know how to edit a calendar, or somebody does, then I'll try to get that taken off. But I'll put it in the notes.
All right. Thanks. Take care, y'all.